Okay, I decided to record this again just because the first one took way too long. And I said something a little incorrect in the first one. So win-win. All right, we're looking at Argo CD UI right now. And this topic is covering when using Crossplane with Argo CD, should you start with a composite resource XR or the composite resource claim XRC? I had written a blog post, I made some opinions, and at the time I was thinking composite resource was the place to start, and there were controls we could put in place. But then I talked to some people on my team, my peers, and looked at it numerous times, and I really come back to one of the opinions I started with in the very beginning, which is Argo CD really shouldn't track things and consider them for synchronization beyond what's in the repo itself. GitOps says we want what's in our repo to match what's in our cluster. And that means those three resources where Argo CD would start and Argo CD would stop. Anywhere past that point, the controllers are taking over. So whether it's a deployment or an XRC that's defined as a custom API within Crossplane, the controllers are going to pick up, and anything that's created downstream from there is purview to the controller to know whether it's in sync or not. Argo CD can only make a best effort guess to assume that those extra resources are related and part of the synchronization from what was deployed from the repo. So long story short, my opinion is that a GitOps platform shouldn't concern itself with related subordinates or downstream resources created from the top level resources in the repo cluster. I'm going to take you through a couple of views of this UI and walk through some of the details of that in a little more detail now. So we have the repo I'm pulling from, as I said, we have these three resources here. And if I synchronize this, we'll see what we normally see if we're first coming to Argo CD and using Crossplane within it. We see this out of sync. And as you can see, my PVC is synced, my deployment is synced. But down here, we're seeing the composite resource claim, which says, okay, everything's fine. And then we're seeing composite resource itself and all of its subordinates or downstream resources showing out of sync. Why is this happening? Well, we have to recap that a composite resource claim is a namespace resource that creates a composite resource, which is a global resource or a cluster scope resource. Very similar to PVC being a namespace resource, and that creates, if there's a storage class defined, a persistent volume that is a cluster scoped resource. And we don't see that here. So there's the first thing we see a little bit differently. These are both namespace resources creating cluster scoped resources. In the case of PVC, we don't see anything. In the case of Crossplane with the namespace claim, we're seeing the cluster scoped composite resource itself, right? So we'll get to the bottom of why is that. And then I want to talk a little bit more about how Argo CD operates with regards to these downstream subordinate resources. I opened the video saying Argo CD shouldn't, or any GitOps platform for that matter, shouldn't concern itself with these layers of resources. And that's because they're not defined in the repo. I feel fairly strongly now that a GitOps platform should have an interface for controllers to speak to if it wants to convey this deeper level of relationship, because the controllers, after all, are what understand what should be downstream from this top level resources created out of the Git repo. The way Argo CD achieves this is by using owner reference chains. Owner reference is part of Kubernetes garbage collection. Its intent is to protect resources that shouldn't be deleted from being deleted when a higher order object is. So there are some rules applied to it and enforced that say a namespace resource cannot be the owner of a cluster scoped resource or a resource that resides in another namespace. Since Argo CD is adopting the use of the owner reference chain to define these relationships, any ecosystem solution or custom operator you may write that will have a namespace resource in a relationship chain to cluster scoped or resources in other namespaces won't be correlated or rationalized. It can't do it because you cannot create an owner reference chain between those resources. So that's one high level issue I have, I think, with this notion of tracking these downstream resources as part of deciding whether or not something's synchronized or not. Now, why is this showing up? We talked about these owner reference chains. That's one part of the picture. The other part is that when we have these resource manifests coming from our repo via our GitOps platform into our cluster and running, what Argo CD will do is add a label to it. So if we look at the labels for PVC, we see this app Kubernetes IO instance, and then values AKS cluster. So we see that that's the name of, this is not in the cluster, this is the application for Argo CD that we define that controls all of these resources. That's the name of it. So it knows that this PVC that's running is a top level resource that should come from the repo it's configured for, and know that it needs to match those up. And we can see in the deployment, if we look at the labels, we're going to see the same thing: app Kubernetes IO instance AKS cluster. Nuance of Crossplane: when we create a composite resource claim, the labels that are within that claim get replicated into the composite resource itself. So just as Argo CD took this manifest from our repo, it added that label, AKS cluster. And when Crossplane then picked up that XRC and created this composite resource, it took that label and placed it here as well. So now Argo CD is looking at this composite resource and thinking that it's supposed to be tracking it, and it knows it's not in the repo, so it's reporting it out of sync. If Argo CD used a different labeling method or another method altogether to decide what's in the repo and what's in the cluster, this wouldn't happen. If Crossplane didn't take the literal labels from here and transfer them to here, it wouldn't happen. I don't know what the solution is. We're talking about it on both community issue boards, and we'll find out. But in the meantime, what I feel is, and what I believe is the right thing to do, is to simply configure Argo CD not to pay attention to the XR that's created from the XRC. It's just giving it kind of a don't look at this no matter what kind of statement. And we see we have cluster resource allow list and then deny list. And if I edit this, I'll come down to cluster resources, and I'll go ahead and add one. The resource in this case is the composite resource X cluster. And we have to place in the API path that we've defined for it. And from there, we should be good. So now, if we go back to our application, synchronize it again, everything's good. The application is synchronized, the sync is okay. We're not paying attention to those composite resources any longer. And ultimately, I feel like this is the way it should look. How we get there would be great if we didn't have to go in and manually configure that. And again, that's part of what the projects are working out. But in the meantime, if you are going to use Argo CD with Crossplane, I recommend using a deny or an ignore rule within the project and only tracking to your claim. Now, that's not to say we're not going to have a platform view, right? So on the platform, we have applications that are tracking and synchronizing the compositions and the composite resource definitions themselves. So that exists here at the platform purview. And then when we come back, developer type persona, this is what they're going to be placing into their repos. Hope that helps. And I'll have more content as it comes.